Chapter 681. Repurpose Magic. General Marshall brought out a large blanket and began setting out weapons on it. The loot that he had purchased from Dominic. Listen up, everyone. This is what we have obtained, along with 12 tons of food that is currently in my storage ring. Westover Duchy is willing to continue doing business with us, so as long as we can keep up our end of the bargain, we no longer need to fear a poor crop. What we promised him was spell gems with a value equivalent to this. Duplicates of the basics are fine. They are raising their own militia to protect the duchy, but the rare and exclusive magics have a higher value, so if you can make them, or have extras already stored, please turn them over. I know that the army has the means, and now we will have the weapons to drive the monsters out of our homes. He shouted. The crowd cheered, though most of them still looked rather startled to see the general so lucid. Normally, he was a man of very few words, and the trolls would do most of the speaking for him, while he did the combat planning. Nobody was a better tactician than he was, but that was almost entirely on a primal level. General Marshall had an astonishing sense of danger and intuition into the likely ambushes and tactics of the monsters. Soon, they were piling spell gems on the blanket as a form of exchange. It was an unspoken trade system. Everyone had some idea what the spell gems were worth and what the weapons were worth. The general reserved the 4 rifles, handing them directly to the officers in the Burlish Resistance Army. But other than that, everyone just picked and paid for what they could get. Interestingly to Dominic, the spears actually went before the pistols. Not because they were short on valuables. He could see them sorting through bags of spell gems for the rare ones, then topping the payment off with the common body enhancement spells. It was just that they knew the spears so well, and that was their role in the battle. So, they wanted the best spear they could get, and the soldiers who were archers now were the ones who picked the pistols. It kept their battlefield role, while improving their firepower. Dominic watched the gems collect, and tried to guess what some of the gems were for. The majority of common gems had a distinct shape or color that made them easy to identify without actually inspecting them. But some of these were completely new to him. There was one that seemed to flicker with yellow fire inside a red egg-shaped gemstone, and he was certain that it should be something valuable. But he couldn't tell what the spell was from here. Once all the weapons were chosen, the general brought the blanket full of gems over and sheepishly shook the sand off it. Dominic winked at him and held out an empty flour sack. Just dump them in and I will shake the sand out. It's all good. It looks like we've made a fine trade today. Come back whenever you want. I suspect that it won't be too long, as most of that food is perishable. General Marshall laughed. We bought out all the canning jars that your warehouse had. I think that we can make the food last a bit longer than shelf life. Of course, it would last a long time in a storage device as well. But that was a different matter. Once he had his payment, Dominic waved goodbye to the resistance fighters, and the mages closed the portal, leaving him standing at the gate with a bag full of spell gems and a burning curiosity. The first thing that he did was to take out the gem that looked like it was burning inside. Being so fancy, he assumed that it had to be some sort of rare and powerful spell, at the very least. The more interesting the spell, the more beautiful the gem was. It seemed to be a universal rule to spell gems. Spell gem of Flame Storm, area damage spell. Creates a zone of intense fire around the caster or a designated location. That was cool, though possibly impractical. Throwing fireballs at enemies was fun, but this was intended to target a specific location. For a defensive battle, it was much less useful than for a raider setting camps on fire. That wasn't the only good one in the bag, though. There was a gem for Earthquake, an earth element favorite of the mages which could shake enemies off their feet and throw stones straight up into a horde of enemies. And then Dominic found a curious red gem that his sorcerer's spellbook identified as Shuriken Wall when he recorded the new magic. Shuriken Wall creates a line of rotating blades that travel forward at high speed. It was a magical mobile blender. That was going to make such a horrific mess the first time that he used it on goblins. Something like running a tiller through the battlefield. No, this spell could actually be a wonderful tiller. If he used it on the surface of a field, it would till it perfectly in seconds. Perhaps not the intended use of the magic, but it would revolutionize the preparation of cropland. especially for fields that hadn't been worked in a decade. Amy, come check this spell out. I need a lot of copies of it made. I want to distribute it to the mages to till fields for the new farms. Dominic called. The small mage jogged over to where he was standing and inspected the gem in his hand. That's certainly a unique one. Imagine what it will do to a line of goblins. Dominic chuckled. That was my first thought as well. Then I realized it could be aimed to till the ground it passed over. 4 overgrown fields and gardens, this would give them freshly turned earth in seconds. It will get them ready to go after their first harvest so much faster, and it will help with our lack of tractors and farm equipment. At least long enough for the factory to catch up and someone to find a way to incorporate this into a plow. Chapter 682. Sort the Treasure. Dominic brought the bag of gems into the house and set them down in the sitting room so that he could go through them with Amy in relative quiet. Then he realized that the house was actually unnervingly silent. Everyone had left, either to work or back home. And that left only the long-term residents here, who were mostly also at work right now. The house hadn't been this empty in a long time, and the only people that Dominic could hear moving around were the staff, and who was most likely Prince Russell's wife. She didn't move with the same efficient step that the staff did, more of a slow stroll, and she was limping, most likely holding their child on one hip. They had taken up rooms in the manor, despite the prince initially intending to move either to the new bank building or to one of the outlying courtyards, perhaps even a house in town. However, when his wife had arrived, she put her foot down, insisting that moving to a whole other building only made more work for the staff, and had insisted on staying here. Now that Alexis was pregnant, she was even more adamant. Their little ones would only be a year apart, and she was hoping that the princess would have a son first, so that their boys could grow up together. If they weren't going to be first cousins, the usual setup would be to hope for a daughter, so they would grow up together as an obvious marriage alliance. But the unusual situation of 2 members of the royal family living in the same town outside the capital made things a bit more complex. Fortunately, there were many barons who lived nearby, so her son would have local marriage options should they produce daughters within the next few years. Given the enthusiasm shown at the dating event, she suspected that it was likely. Most of these are common ones, at least for a mage sect. But with all the new students coming in, this is going to save us 1,000 hours of labor. That alone is worth far more than the weapons we traded for them. Amy noted. Agreed. An afternoon of my work for a week's work for an entire team of mages? A most excellent trade. If we keep a running deal with them, we could likely have a spell gem shop in town. That would draw all sorts of customers to town from the Merchant and Adventurers Guild. Spell gems aren't easy to get, even for our teams who are constantly killing monsters. Are you ever intending to close that ritual? Not really. If the one who created it wants it closed, they can do it themselves. They went to all that trouble to put up such a great barrier over it and everything. It would be a shame to waste their hard work. Dominic replied with a smile. Amy refrained from mentioning that the one who cast the spell was likely that pile of bones around the altar, not a living person anymore. Instead, she kept sorting the spell gems into types. Well, we've got more than enough of all the basic malicious spell gems. But there is something odd about that army. They're clearly mostly sorcerers, mixed blood sorts. They aren't a trained mage sect, but they have so many spell gems. I think that they actually use them as a form of currency, since the region doesn't have their own coins. Amy noted. That was a good point. Everyone had spell gems, but not everyone would have the gem creation spell to make them. Not everyone was even capable of using it, and he didn't see a trade skill core on most of them. So, they were most likely relying on the mages to make the spell gems, then trading them for resources, both internally and externally. Burlish really was an odd place. That wasn't an immediate concern for them, though. Even if they were in regular contact, it was still on the far side of the continent, and it needed strong mages or a whole team of them to get here even with a portal array device to guide them. Alright, we've got a few new spells, a lot of duplicates of the 6 new spells that you've already received. Well, plenty of copies of some of them. We've got a load of Earthquake and Wall of Bramble spells, only 1 more Wings of Light spell, and it came from one of the officers to pay for his rifle. Amy informed him when they finished. Well, that's one for someone else. Might as well get it to one of the sex researchers, who can memorize it and make copies. Getting that spell deployed will let us make a larger Special Forces troop. If we can get enough of them, I have an idea for a modified paratrooper force. Amy laughed. Having winged soldiers jump out of airships to fire down at the battlefield would be the sort of egregious violation of fair play that the losing side would remember for a generation. It would be glorious. All right, I will have one of the elders bring it up at their meeting. We've got a lot on our plate already, with the school getting so many new students who know absolutely nothing. But they're working on it. Dominic laughed. That will be an issue, won't it? A lot of the new arrivals have potential, but they're starting so late, with no formal education, that it's like taking in a bunch of kindergarten students. Overgrown ones, with an imminent need for a career and no training to get them into one. Major cities have a lot of retail workers, and Westover just isn't at that point yet. We're getting there. But mostly we're full of young people who still work the shop for super long shifts and are reluctant to hire and pay out that money before they're established. It's putting pressure on the new arrivals with no skills. But in the next half year things should begin to settle, and then our students will be able to pick up part-time work, which will let us start culling the ones with the least potential to ever actually do more than use Magitech devices. That's going to be a rough week. Give me advance warning, and we will try to do something that will distract them from their pain. Chapter 683. Bulk Prep. Once the gems were sorted, Amy took the ones that weren't for the militia directly to the sect so that they could have the elders make copies, while the common spell gems were distributed to the barons to build up their guard teams. That left Dominic in the forge, and a long list of work to do in front of him. There were weapons for the barons' militias and guards, items for trade to keep up the funding of the duchy, which seemed to need more with every passing day, and then a few small things that needed repair around the house. The weapons were the first thing to go, as they were the easiest to do, without worry of quantity. There were never too many. The first thing he made was more pistols. They didn't have to be high level, as the majority of the threats that they were going to see in the duchy were goblins, hobgoblins, and gnolls, all of which were normally level 5 or under threats. Even an uncommon grade level 5 revolver would deal with them efficiently, assuming that the user could actually hit their target. That was the advantage of mana weapons. They didn't have to worry about munitions, just recovery time between practice rounds. If the user had decent skills, they could usually become passively adept in the course of a few days. Goblins were safer to deal with from a distance, as he had learned while working with Wiz and Bella. Dominic simply made batch after batch of level 5 mana pistols of swiftness designed for mana regeneration, his standard bonus, using the one dwarven forge rune that he was certain of his skill at using. It was a shame that he didn't get a chance to learn more from Pops while they were in the forge, but there would be time later. Now that he was working on his own projects in the forge near the center of the city, Pops wasn't under the same level of scrutiny that he was while they were at the palace, so there would surely be a chance for Dominic to make his way over and gain some new knowledge. Just not today. For today's work, Dominic was slightly altering the casting for the pistols so that chamber and the frame of the weapon both showed that they were Westover duchy property. That way nobody got ideas about selling them, and nobody in the region would buy them, even if they were functionally identical to dozens of others that were available to adventurers and wealthy merchants. It was a small thing, but it would also assure the barons that when they handed them out they would see them again in combat. Of course, many of them would also be seen out in the woods, hunting for monsters and wild game. Dominic had noticed many of the hunters and farmers carrying their issued spears with them when they went out, as the area had quite a few wild boars, and the creatures could get nasty when challenged. But they were also a pest of the highest order and would completely destroy a garden in under an hour if they came with a pack. That wasn't as much of an issue near the city. The boars did try to avoid large groups of humans. But in the baronies, or further out at the more remote farms, they got brave enough to approach. And while losing a portion of a crop was painful, losing the garden was a tragedy. That was the variety in their diet, the essential ingredients to go with whatever they were growing for market. Dominic let his mind wander as he forged and quality controlled the structure of the weapons, planning to enhance them all by batches, depending on what was required of them at the time. He knew that they needed hundreds of level 5 revolvers and spears for the militia. But he also knew that the adventurers and merchants would want something significantly better and most likely rare grade. Some of that work had to be done at the start, as the weapons were being made, as they required Magitech circuitry to add features. But some of it did not, and could be added at the end, with circuitry sketched on the surface and a Magitech orb embedded in the handle area. It was all a calculated risk that he would run out of what people wanted. Still, if he did run out, he could just make more and keep the others in reserve. The forge was relaxing, not quite mindless, but intensely focused on predictable issues so that he didn't have to worry about anything other than the perfection of the weapons that he was creating. That made it perfect after such a stressful month. By the time that Amy came back to tell him that dinner was ready, Dominic had the small forge in the manor grounds filled with half-prepared weapons, ready to be finalized with an influx of mana and a bath in monster core-infused mana oil. The spear still needed sharpening, but that wouldn't take too long, and he would have Amy's help for the time-consuming parts. All right, let's go in and see how everyone else is doing. What has my lovely wife been up to all day? Dominic asked, writing notes to the barons for the batches of basic enhancement spell gems that we collected. She's sending them all enough for their personal guard, 10 sets each. That's enough men to protect a small barony house and compound. At least from most things anyhow. She thought that it would be better if she wrote them up herself instead of having the maids do it for her. They're all trained to have beautiful handwriting, but the princess has a rather unique script, and the personalized service is a nice touch. That's a lot of notes to be written, so it's taken her all day to finish them, even though she kept them short. The packages are going out in the morning, and they've already been sent over to the Merchants Guild for delivery. They've got trucks making the loop again tomorrow, so everyone should have their gems in a few days at the most. Dominic nodded. Perfect. That's one more major issue down. How many does that leave us at? About 98? Yeah, that sounded just about right. Chapter 684. Projecting Power. That dinner was the start of the good days, as far as Dominic was concerned. In the mornings, he reviewed paperwork in his office and had a meeting with all the advisors. In the afternoons, he made more weapons in the forge, then spent quiet evenings in. For over a month, nothing broke that quiet routine, and Dominic was certain that they were finally finding their groove. The airship docks had made their third delivery, and the duchy's coffers were flush with cash. Out of town, the farms were taking advantage of a few dry days to pick some of the root vegetables to keep the market full of fresh produce, and the wet season was beginning to fade, with the crops nearing full growth. Once those were up and the new pulse crop silos were filled, the duchy would be able to assess their output and sales potential for the season. Dominic had, on the advice of advisors Jack and Jenna, refrained from making any large sales to the Merchants Guild in advance of the harvest. It was common for them to buy the crops while they were still growing, and then the farmers would have some income coming while they waited. It meant less money later. But normally, it was only needed because of tax collections that didn't match with harvests, and Dominic hadn't ordered one yet. Today was a big day for Westover. Not as a city, but because it was the king's birthday, a national holiday. That meant that Dominic and Alexis would be expected to either send a gift home or go visit the capital for the celebrations to deliver their congratulations. At first, Alexis had wanted to send a gift back home, but after advice from her royal guard, it was decided that they would go in person. The politics around Westover Duchy were still murky, and making a personal appearance, obviously pregnant and obviously doing well, would make a statement that the duchy was growing into the power of its title. There were also other nobles for Dominic to meet. He hadn't really spent any time around other Signian upper nobility, other than their children at the debutante event, and getting to know them would be vital to the export prospects of Westover Duchy and Stantia Province as a whole. Which also meant that he needed to collect a few of the Stantia Province nobles this morning, as they wouldn't be able to get to the capital on their own, and Alexis didn't want the other high nobles to think that they were as isolated as the map suggested. All right, we've sent mages to Limsbury, Coster, and Westfield. The earls are each bringing 2 counts and a retinue. That should be manageable for transportation at the other end, unless you want to put on a show. Alexis noted. Dominic shook his head. I think that simply arranging ground transport should be fine. How about we just use the ones here at the manor? We've got trucks to bring everyone, and if we drape a Stantia Province banner on them, we can show a united front. Not bad. I was going to say to have them all fly the duchy banners to project power. But coming as representatives of the provinces reminds everyone that you're also the governor. Remember that while the position holds immense actual power, to the old noble families, it will matter less than the title of duke, which is hereditary and not easily revocable. Alexis reminded him. Dominic nodded. And I need to keep my eyes open for the young heirs of Castle City, Darden and Skypington, as well as the new Marquis Burton. According to Lord Blackwell, it's important that I build relationships with the next generation of counts and earls in the region closest to Stantia province. Did I mention that all these political meetings give me a headache? Alexis smiled and patted him on the shoulder. One way or another, he was destined for it. The longer that she spent around the residence of Westover, the more obvious it became that Dominic could have settled anywhere and attracted an army to himself simply by announcing his lineage. The fact that they were married, and Westover became a powerful duchy instead of the hub of a civil war, was simply a fluke of fate. Alexis sent for the trucks, the matched locally made buses that were the public transit vehicles in Westover. She noticed someone else joining them. A small blonde in a fancy silk dress. And you are? Amy winked at her. Good to know that I haven't lost my touch. For the purposes of this trip, I am the youngest daughter of the Baron of Skipton River, a border barony between Stantia and Kynwyn provinces. On the river, as the name implies. There is no fear of them arriving to counter your argument. They all died in the flood helping their people escape to Westover, and this face is that of their daughter. I will be your lady in waiting for the day, a final safeguard against attacks that might sneak past your guards. You know, it's just uncanny how well you can change your appearance. If you weren't limited to being roughly your own size, we would be in trouble. Amy nodded. Give me some time. With the help of the trolls and the witches, I'm beginning to recover from my old injuries. I tell you, it's not easy to find anyone who knows how to treat the ailments of the less common magical species. Amy was wearing a bright blue mage-class trade skill core that Alexis knew was not her own. Hers was a very dark red, blood-soaked, and a bit evil-looking. This one would cause the others to assume that she was nothing more than a level 4 or 5 mage acolyte. A minor noble would be proud of that at her apparent age, though it wasn't all that impressive. It also wouldn't threaten anyone brave enough to try to assassinate the princess. But if there was an actual threat, the doppelganger would be a reliable defender. Are you sure that we should take the buses? Commander Wilkes asked as the buses were brought over. Of course. We've tagged them with the banner and hung curtains on the windows. They don't look as much like public transit now, and they will remind all the nobles we pass on the way and that we make state-of-the-art Magitech vehicles. Bringing any sort of transport that we didn't make ourselves would be a disservice to the duchy. Dominic countered. They were still hard not to see as stretched light transport vehicles designed for off-road use, though. Chapter 685. Bring the others. The other Stantia province nobles arrived at the gates and tried not to look like they were staring at the Westover Manor. The complex was akin to a proper castle, with its defensive fortifications and sprawling complex, with emergency farms and shops inside the walls. Plus, it was all newly renovated, nothing in need of repair at all. That was more than any of them could claim about the estates that they had taken over after the war. Like Dominic, they were all newly raised nobles, assigned noble titles based on their family's contributions and reputation. So, they also had to make a good impression. That was why they had agreed to come along on this outing to the Cygnian capital, despite being on the furthest side of the nation. Nobody would expect them to come. It was weeks or even a month to get there by ground in the wet season. By air, with the new airships, they could have collected everyone and made it there in 2 days. But coming by portal to the city gates, then driving through the noble district to the palace would be much more visible than coming to the airship docks, where the airship would be all that anyone noticed as they were hustled into royal carriages. Once they were in the carriages, surrounded by guards, nobody in the common districts or the lower nobility would know who was arriving. But if they brought their own vehicles, they could flag them up for the occupants and let everyone bask in the glory of Stantia province. On a road trip, you didn't normally want to put the personal flag of a noble riding in a vehicle, as it could invite trouble. But within the capital, that wasn't really an issue. All right, are we all ready to head out? Alexis asked as soon as the last of the nobles had arrived. Yes, Your Highness. Each team can take their own transport. We have enough of them. It might be a bit crowded, but you should be able to fit with your retinue. They're designed to hold 12 people, plus anyone hanging onto the outside, she explained. They didn't actually need to have armed guards hanging on the outside of the vehicles. But 2 guards in dress uniforms standing on the back step would give them a bit of extra stylish flair. Did the person designing these not believe in doors? One of the barons whispered, a bit too loudly. Dominic laughed. The driver's door is the only one that they have because all the other seats are designed for soldiers to easily get in and out. They're public transit, but they're also the primary deployment method for our militia and city guards. I have passenger doors for the front in storage somewhere, but the windows are open to shoot out of, and because it gets hot here, and they don't have any other ventilation. If you put curtains over the windows, they will feel properly enclosed. The weather in the capital is supposed to be rather cool today, so you might want to actually close the curtains in advance. Then we will go directly to the city gates by portal. We have arranged it with our mages. There was a portal travel array outside the city, which they would use as their locator beacon to make the extended portal distance a bit more manageable. But still, with that sort of distance, it would take a group of mages to make a portal large enough to drive trucks through. It was a good thing that they were leaving Dave here with Jack Merlot to keep the house safe while they were gone, even if it would make quite the scene in the capital. Fortunately, the converted transports were only a bit larger than 2 soldiers marching in ranks, in both height and width. The nobles loaded into the closest transports with their teams, or the noble who had sponsored them for the trip, and the convoy began to move. Your Grace, why are you in the front? Ella, the royal guard who had been chosen to drive the princess vehicle, asked as Dominic hopped in beside her. For dramatic effect. Trust me. Dominic was in his official royal sorcerer uniform with a shiny breastplate that he had made back when he was working in the palace. It was shiny, decorative, and still useful enough for the situation. But more than that, it left no doubt as to who was in the convoy after Ella pulled to the front of the line to get the guards to let them in. Invitations to the palace for the king's birthday, she informed the guard at the city gates. Paladin Ella, good day. Who vouches for this convoy? I do. Dominic informed him, and the guard did a double take, expecting to be handed a letter of recommendation, not to have a duke personally in the passenger seat of the first truck. In fact, he hadn't expected Dominic to be in the first vehicle at all. At most, he would be in the second, with a load of soldiers in the first truck in case of trouble. That was standard protocol. Understood, Your Grace. Please follow the designated route through the city. It has been flagged and lined with soldiers to keep the crowds from blocking all progress. Welcome back to the capital. Dominic nodded, and the convoy began to move, while Dominic waved at the commoners who had come to see the visiting nobles. The people looked somewhat shocked to see him out in the open, as the whole town was at least familiar with the story of Duke Westover at this point. A rags to riches, lost prince, reclaiming a dukedom through pure gallantry in battle-type story. Or so it was told here in the capital. Some suspected that the truth was less dramatic, but those who were a bit older suspected that it was actually much more gruesome than they were being told. Plenty of noble sons performed heroic acts during the war, even sacrificing themselves for the protection of the royal family. None of them got a dukedom. Only a few of them even claimed a barony. Chapter 686. Through the City. As they passed by the staging area where the adventurers prepare to head out for their daily missions, Dominic noticed that a few of the soldiers from each of the trucks had moved to the back step, doing their best to look dignified, while showing off for their friends and the onlookers in the capital. Many of them were members of the Adventurers Guild before they were hired as personal guards for the nobles, and there were definitely people that they knew in this crowd who would be interested to know how they were doing. It would be even better if they were jealous of the success. It feels like we're celebrities, not you or the princess. The people on the streets are actually cheering for the drivers and guards. Ella whispered, low enough that nobody in the back of the truck would hear her. Dominic winked at her. You've earned some recognition. Besides, they're not wrong. After the monster siege, the lower city gained a new admiration for the armed forces and adventurers. The royal guard smiled softly. They normally served in silence, their visors down. Few knew who they were and even fewer cared. They were dedicated for life, or at least as much of it as they could fight for, to the service of their royal. They didn't do it for outside admiration or glory, and that wasn't something that they expected to get. However, things were changing. The nobles were still a source of admiration, the fabulously wealthy or immensely powerful. But the royal guards were a much more relatable hero to the crowds here by the gates. Every street that they were led down by the column of guards was packed with spectators who had come to watch the noble convoys roll into the palace for the king's birthday. It was quite the scene, but as they reached the west side of town, the closest thing that the capital had to a poor area, given that the truly poor had all been forced outside the walls before they fled during the monster tax, Dominic remembered that there was a tradition. He opened the door and hopped up on the roof of the truck, then took out handfuls of copper coins from his storage device and scattered them in a wide arc through the crowd. The workers, beggars, and invalids of the roughest neighborhood cheered for the generosity and for the fact that Dominic had a strong enough arm that the coins were actually making it back into the crowd, not just to the presentable front row that the guards had picked. A few copper coins weren't much, a cheap meal or a beer for whoever caught them, but that was a few copper coins more than they had before the Duke had rolled by, and he was tossing them all through the crowd. The taverns and bakeries would be busy tonight. Of course, Dominic wasn't targeting anyone. He was scattering coins like buckshot into the crowd, a few everywhere. So it was all up to luck whether the ones who needed it most were actually the ones to get it. Either way, in a couple of hours, it would be the shopkeepers who had the coins. It would be impossible for anyone in the crowd to miss who was throwing the coins to them. Not some random guard assigned the task, but the Duke himself. The horns were a dead giveaway. Plus, he was throwing them in a fairly steady stream, a handful every few seconds. Just enough time that they were past the last group who might have gotten any. He would go through a lot of coins that way, but they were only passing through the edge of the district before they entered the polished stone of the noble district, and then there would be no more hungry crowds in need of coin from the nobility. Meaning, he didn't have to hold back for fear of running out of copper. The truck made the turn into the noble district, and Dominic returned to his seat, only to find Ella laughing at him. "I didn't think that you'd actually do it. You know, most of the nobles just take out a single bag of copper and have them distributed. Usually, they don't simply hurl money at the crowd these days. They give the coin to the guards, who pass it out along the road," she explained quietly. "Where's the fun in that? Then only the front row gets the money. This way, everyone gets a little. I'm sure that Jack will approve of us funding a few of the drunkards who linger in the back." He wasn't wrong. Jack would always approve of funding a drunkard's evening, especially an old one with little to live for but the next drink. The crowds in the noble district were no less packed along the route than they were anywhere else, but Dominic did notice that some of the trucks behind them opened the curtains to let those along the road see who was passing by, now that they were in a safer neighborhood, with crowds of people they might know. He sighed softly at the bias, but understood. To those who weren't from that side of town, the reputation was usually enough to keep you from ever willingly going there. If the guards hadn't been lining the road to lead them through, none of the noble convoys would have taken that route. They had only done it because the city guard was treating their arrival like a parade. And the parade was getting attention now that they were among people who knew what they were looking at. The modified transports were the single most practical vehicles that anyone had brought to the palace this year, and they were clearly a fully Magitech design, not a modified carriage. A sales pitch for the factories in Westover that didn't need any ads or eloquent speeches. Just quietly rolling vehicles passing through the district on soft rubber tires. Chapter 687. Share the news. A whole unit of palace guards was waiting at the parking area when Dominic's convoy rolled up and instantly threw the whole process into chaos with their unusual designs. Most noble transports had doors on the side, the standard for carriages for 1,000 years. But the ones that they had brought loaded from the back, so the usual positioning of the footmen and guards was all wrong. Then, there was Dominic sitting in the front seat, while everyone else came out the back. The guards had planned for this, though. They filed out of the vehicles and arranged themselves to guide the nobles out of the vehicles, while Dominic simply stepped out of the truck and moved to the front of the group to wait for the princess. At first, the palace attendant who was here to greet them looked startled, but after a moment he realized that Dominic was waiting for the princess, instead of going to greet the other dukes and higher nobles who were standing nearby. They would split up in a moment, so that she could meet with the ladies while the lords gathered to talk their own business. But it was a sign of respect that he waited, so that they could both be introduced together. A sign that she was more involved than most in the daily operations of the duchy. Of course, most married noblewomen ran the house itself, and often the majority of the town's cultural policy. But less often the businesses, or the rural areas and agricultural production. And that would be the part that the other nobles gathered to see who had come for the party would want to talk about. However, that was not Dominic's purpose in waiting. Alexis stepped out, flanked by a group of her veiled maids, with Amy at her arm, playing the part of a helpful lady in waiting. The princess dress was designed in what Signia colloquially called the maternity fashion, fitted around the midriff, but without a corset. It showed off the curve of her belly, and Dominic smiled as the nobles gasped, then began to clap. "You know that they're clapping for you as well, Your Grace," the palace steward informed him. "I don't think that my part in this is the sort of thing you applaud in public." "I'll gladly accept the applause once I have an heir," Dominic whispered back. The steward smiled, then turned to the crowd, announcing the Duke and Duchess of Westover. Dominic bowed, while Alexis curtsied, and then they split up to greet their respective peers. They had made their statement, and now Dominic had to get down to business. The announcement would give everyone a good reason to come up and greet him, without consideration for rank. Normally, it would be easy for one or two higher-ranking nobles to monopolize his time, and the others wouldn't get a chance to talk shop at all. But with his heir on the way, it was expected that everyone would give way to the congratulatory greetings, and the lower nobles who had business with Westover could hand him a note at the very least. "Westover, congratulations. I must say, your success has completely decimated our betting pool," one of the other nobles greeted him. It took a second for Dominic to place the man, then realized that it was Duke Devencrone, the father of Darlys, the boy who had led the first group that he had gone out hunting goblins with after he entered Westover. He had done his best to memorize the names and images of the upper nobility, but most of the images were stylized, or much younger than the current nobles were. "Devencrone, it's a pleasure to meet you. I had a chance to meet your son once in the past, but I believe this is the first time we've had the opportunity." The other duke smiled and shook his head. "I was at a few other events, but never found the chance to speak with you," meaning that at the time, Dominic's rank wasn't high enough to have caused the Duke to notice him when there was so much else to be done during the formal events at the palace. "Have you met Earl Tarley?" Duke Devencrone added as the older man came over with two teen boys following behind him. "I have not. As was the case with us, I had met some of the younger generation first." The Earl laughed. My oldest son was in the running for the betrothal to Princess Alexis. However, he has managed to find himself a lovely bride from Rothliakia while he was on a trade voyage to their port at Causewest." As Dominic recalled, Causewest was the capital of the nation, a city of 500,000, and one of the largest ports on the east coast. It was a bit shocking to hear that the Earl's oldest son was traveling with a merchant ship, but it might have been for a particular reason, and that would take too long to get into when they were surrounded by other nobles and waiting for the others from Stantia province to be announced. Earl Tarley shook Dominic's hand and spoke softly. "If there's a chance later, I need to speak with you about those delightful airships. The guild flew one to me last week, and I am highly interested in purchasing one of the same model." Dominic nodded. "Find me later. We've only got a few on the waiting list at the moment, so we should be able to get you one before summer." It wasn't optimal to make customers wait for airships, but these were a bespoke custom purchase, not something that could be completely pre-made. Every customer would want something slightly personalized, as well as different custom options added. But compared to ordering a traditional ship, which often took a year or more to be ready after ordering, they still had a very short turnaround time. "That is excellent news. Getting a high-speed trade ship for my fleet this year is a dream come true," the Earl declared. Duke Devencrone rolled his eyes, but remained silent. It was clear that while the Earl was a man of wealth, the fact that his city was best known for rough taverns, questionable merchants, and prostitution did not make him a popular party guest. Chapter 688. Shocking Thorvald. While Dominic talked to the nobles about airships and various trade-related issues, Alexis found herself surrounded by many of her childhood friends and the ladies of the palace, all of whom had platitudes to offer, and no shortage of jealousy for her supposed luck in not only finding such a successful husband, but in providing a potential heir the first year. That was a big thing for the ladies of the nobility. The faster that you could produce a son to take over the title, the more secure your position was, and the less likely that your husband would adopt a son from the extended family, as the ladies politely referred to it. Now, that was sometimes what happened, but not as often as it was used as an excuse to bring an illegitimate child into the house as the heir after no son was found to be forthcoming. Is it true that you held an event that saw 1,000 noble ladies married? One of the noble daughters asked as she made her way to the front of the crowd. As much as it felt like it, no. There were about 400 in total. A large portion of them married the knights and barons in Westover Duchy, but we did have multiple airships come from around Signia with noble sons. There were a few higher-ranking ones, but most of them were the younger daughters of lower nobles who couldn't secure a marriage alliance at home. The natural sons getting titles for the entire regiment was a huge event for them. Alexis agreed. Oh, it totally was. My neighbor was at the event and ended up married to a lovely knight named Tate. I'm not sure if that's right. She always calls him Potato. Alexis laughed. Melissa was your neighbor then? His name is Abe. He was a member of the Natural Sons Regiment, and he's now one of our own Westover region nobles. They're the most absolutely adorable couple. Actually, he should be here somewhere. I think the nobles from that side of the province were in one of the later trucks in the convoy, so they might not be unloaded yet. Oh, that is lovely. I didn't know him that well, though. I just knew that Melissa was absolutely obsessed with him. The other noble ladies laughed at the memory. They all knew someone like her, a girl obsessed with her childhood friend. It was rare that they actually got the boy of their dreams, since most of them were dreaming far above their station. But sometimes it did work out, especially if the dream was more practical. You know, I always thought that the twins were going to end up with a pair of ranking sons from one of the paladin orders. But look how that turned out. One married a royal duke, and actually, that will be both of you, won't it? Thorvald has been named heir to his father, despite being the third son. So, he will be the next Duke North, unless something drastic happens again. Alexis gasped. Oh, I did not know that. What happened? I need the tea. His older brother had a minor indiscretion with a stable boy, and his wife did not take it well. She beat him with a broom in front of the stable, in front of the whole family and half the town. It was a huge scandal, and as punishment for the embarrassment, his position as heir was handed to Thorvald. Which is questionable? I mean, he's capable enough. But counting on Thorvald not to embarrass the family? That's a stretch. He's calmed down since the wedding, but still. Did I hear my name? So this is what the noble ladies speak of when they're left unattended. Sister, my lovely wife would like to speak with you if you have a moment. Thorvald declared, startling all the ladies. You should know that it is rude to eavesdrop, good sir. One of the ladies reminded him. Not my intention at all. However, it was impossible to draw Princess Josephine away from her sparring session, so she sent me to retrieve my new sister. Now, where is my brother-in-law? Alexis laughed and gestured to the cluster of noblemen that had grown so large it was hard to even see the men getting out of the trucks. They were examining the transports, obviously planning to purchase them for use in their cities, or perhaps in their militia, and that made a wall of bodies between where the ladies were standing and where the final few trucks full of nobles were unloading. Well, we can bother him later. It looks like he's got half the palace nobles with him right now, and I'm not local. They might not take it well if I interrupted. Now, would you be so kind as to accompany me to go visit your older sister? Alexis laughed and looped her arm through his. Of course. I don't think that she's heard the news yet, and she is going to absolutely lose it when she does. Thorvald looked confused, then looked down and gasped. You? I can't believe it. Already loved up with the Dragonkin prince? I should have changed my wager. The ladies laughed, and Thorvald had the grace to look a bit embarrassed. How many people are in on the wagering? Alexis asked. Everyone but Claudius? Thorvald guessed, his expression slowly transforming as the realization hit him. That sounded about right. But she was surprised that the princes and the king had known for a month and hadn't told anyone. Or, if they had told anyone, it hadn't become common knowledge. Oh, that's a good reaction face. Now Thorvald is going to fall down the rabbit hole for certain. One of the older noble ladies laughed. He was married to her twin, so they would look nearly exactly the same when pregnant. This was what he had to look forward to, and his father was very enthusiastic about having a royal-blooded heir to the duchy, even if it was a foreign royal lineage. Chapter 689. Sisters' Reunion. Eleanor was with Josephine when Thorvald and Alexis finally made it up to the sitting room near the door of the palace. I had heard that you were pregnant from the boys, but I wasn't sure how far along you were, so I picked somewhere near the door, Josephine joked as her sister entered the room. It hasn't been that long since you saw me. I'm not so pregnant as to be an invalid. I don't know. You look pretty large to me. And that's my cue to leave you fine ladies to your own devices. I will see you later, wifey. Thorvald announced, right before fleeing the room. Well, he didn't last long. How are things going for you in West Kyria? Alexis asked. It's not bad. Northinta has drier weather than we do here in the capital, but it is also warmer. That's nice. They've also agreed to let me start building up a proper paladin order for the duchy. That's going to be a long project. It takes years to train up a proper paladin, even if you're starting with trained soldiers. But once it's done, we will have plenty to be proud of. I'm more interested in how things are going in Westover. Half the news that we get makes no sense, and then we start seeing strange things that seem to confirm the rumors. Alexis smiled at Josephine's confusion. Eleanor had already tried to explain the situation in Westover to her, but she hadn't fully understood a lot of it, and her brothers didn't let her wander the city much or talk to strangers without a chaperone. So, she hadn't been able to find out everything that she wanted to. It really is that good, I'm afraid. The land in Westover is incredible, and we missed the worst of the storm. It's still wet season there, but we didn't get much flooding. The river stayed within its banks, and just ran high for a few weeks. That left us with plenty of crops from the off-season, and now that we've got the natural sons all settled into their territories, things are really starting to look up. We brought a few of them along today, but mostly we were focused on bringing the others from Stantia province. The ones that nobody expected to make it. The idea was that we could remind everyone that there are 3 major cities in Stantia province, each with an earl and multiple counts overseeing their region. Add Westover to that, and Stantia province is in a good position for growth. I think that Dominic is using this chance to get to really know the other noblemen, as he has barely met most of them. We weren't formally introduced when he was named the governor, but everyone here in the capital should know them. Forcing them all to be in one spot, with him as the de facto leader of their faction, will either help stabilize him as a duke or be absolute chaos. Josephine listened to her sister rant, then laughed and patted her on the shoulder. I'm sure that it will be fine. If there is one thing that Dominic Wavemates is good at, it's smooth-talking the nobles. It's a particular gift of his, and if that doesn't work, there's always a pistol duel to sort out the insults. Don't give him ideas. He's already the king of bad ideas. Just the other day, he managed to work a deal with a feral dragonkin and a bunch of trolls so smoothly that everyone assumed that they were part of some civilized bunch of freedom fighters. But the more that I look into the Burlish resistance army, the more I realize that it's barely more than a bandit group with a hatred for monsters. You know, at some point, we're going to have a conversation about what actually constitutes a monster. Because apparently you've decided that trolls no longer count, and convinced the trolls to go along with it. Alexis laughed. I think that is a Dominic side effect as well. For one, he speaks troll, and they understand him far better than anyone else. But it seems the Wavemates family had an agreement with the trolls, and the trolls are willing to uphold it in Westover Duchy as long as his family is in charge. I still haven't gotten the full details, I asked Dave, but he only gives one detail at a time as he remembers them. Who is Dave? Alexis smiled, and Eleanor laughed. Oh, you need to get Dave's in your manner, too. Dave is absolutely wonderful. Josephine waited for Alexis to answer, since her little sister was not giving her the answer she needed. Dave is one of the 2 most popular names for male trolls, making up nearly half the population. We have 50 mountain trolls named Dave working as manor security and personal bodyguards. You haven't lived until you've seen a 3-meter-tall mountain troll in full Magitech battle armor, with a shield the size of your bedroom door. Alexis joked. Josephine sighed. It sounds like you've really gone a whole other route with the duchy. But you look happy. Who would have thought that you would still be in a good mood, even when you were off monster hunting duty for an entire year? Alexis shrugged. There are advantages. But I still get to train my veiled maids and the manor guards. So it's more of an off-season than a restriction. Oh, that's not a bad idea. I've been working on the Paladin Order, but I never thought about setting up a whole new domestic group. Honestly, it would be a huge pain, as the house already has so many skilled staff who have worked there since childhood. Generational staff are not easy to get rid of, and they don't really give you any reason to want to. The only one in the whole house who give me headaches is Thorvald. And that's the only one you can't really kick out if he goes too far. Chapter 690, New Car Salesman. Gentlemen, what do you think? They've proven to be quite the vehicle for Westover, and we've taken to using them for nearly everything that doesn't need a full-sized merchant caravan. Dominic informed the nobles who had gathered to admire the trucks. They're a wonderful design, not so large as most of the ones that we've been seeing lately. It appears that many of the current batch of techno-wizards have the bigger is better ideology, and the new truck designs are becoming larger than the tractors. Sure, that's good for moving lots of cargo, but they're a struggle to get down city streets when they're that long. One of the barons agreed. These look like they're much more practical on the old streets, which aren't as wide as the modern roads are, since they were built for horses to pass each other before we allowed trade caravans in the city. Another agreed. That must have been a wild time in his town, Dominic decided. Even the smallest of baronies at least had a market in the middle of town that you could get to with a trade caravan. Because that trade caravan often was the entire market. Is the price reasonable? They're quite fancy, in the sense that they have a lot of features, not in the gilded carriage way. A younger baron, likely newly elevated after the war, asked. They're actually cheaper than the capital sells a new steam tractor for. We've got an assembly line producing them. They're not individually handcrafted, and that saves a huge amount of time and labor cost for the base vehicle. Plus, it lets us do things like ship them with spare parts. Not many, as they're quite reliable, but each of them carries a spare headlight and a spare tire. Dominic explained. That wasn't exactly revolutionary. Every trade wagon tried to carry at least one spare wheel, in case they got damaged. But the wheels on this one were thin metal discs, with soft rubber tires. So, it would most likely be the tire that was damaged, not the wheel itself. The lights are Magitech. Earl Tarley asked. Naturally. They use the same Magitech core that our line of lanterns does. Actually, you might be interested in those as well, being a seaport. Here, a gift from me to you. Dominic handed the man one of the simple hanging lamps, of the sort that were all over Westover at this point. Hung from carriages, front porches, even placed at the end of laneways to houses, illuminating the road. It made it easier for the farmers to navigate back home at night after the market, if they were among the group using ox carts. Many were now cooperating to use one of the duchy's tractors and a large trailer, the same one used to load crops from the field. They would just stop at a bunch of neighbors and load boxes of produce, so everyone could go to the market together. But eventually, they would all have something of their own. Dominic only charged maintenance fees for the tractors, which let them all get the harvest in and out of the fields in a timely manner. But everyone would prefer to either have one of their own or a mechanical horse. Preferably the tractor, as it was easier to maintain. As cool as the mechanical horses were, there were far too many moving parts to make them walk like a horse and run on magical energy. In comparison, the tractors were relatively simple, and even if you didn't truly know how they worked, the basics of how to patch what was broken and keep it running until you could get it to a proper shop were fairly clear. Dominic knew that they had many new ideas for the advancement of transport vehicles, but that simplicity and ease of repair was the defining factor that kept things the way that they were. Even on these transports, which were considered to be ultramodern, the only major change to the drivetrain had been in the layout of the drivetrain. It still used crankshaft-driven rods to drive the axles. The front steering was a marvel of engineering, according to the manufacturer, but the core design hadn't changed much. The pushrods drove gears in a central box, and spinning shafts transferred the power to the axles. That part was a change from the directly shaft-driven designs. It did add complexity, but if you broke a part, any carriage maker could cast you a new gear using the intact portions. They were just bolted in place. So, while it was a design that none of them would be familiar with, they would understand what they were looking at and how to fix it. Not as easily for farmer in the field, but it was also much more agile than the standard steam tractor, less likely to be stuck somewhere that it couldn't be easily removed from. Dominic's list of potential customers was growing fast, and he was definitely going to have to talk to the carriage works when he got back to Westover. They weren't a Dutchy-owned shop. It was a private group of techno-wizards and smiths who had decided to make their own design of vehicle in a city where there was no other competition other than farm tractors. That meant that Dominic couldn't simply increase production by hiring people, and he wasn't making a direct profit off them. But there were so many people involved in sourcing the materials or working in the factory that it was good for everyone when he promoted Westover businesses in the capital. It also made him look benevolent to the other nobles and their staff. For he wasn't pushing a business he had a direct interest in, he was just promoting the people of his city, and common people at that. The staff members waiting in the background and taking notes would definitely remember. The nobles who vouched for small families were the ones who were going to go the furthest. Because it was the desperate innovators that always came up with the best ideas, before having them swallowed by wealthy nobles or great families in the region. But when that happened, most of the ideas got watered down so far as to be unrecognizable.